So welcome, dear friends. I'm Father John Deere, and welcome to this Beatitude Center Zoom session with our very special guest, my friend Marie Dennis. You can find many other wonderful upcoming Zooms at beatitudecenter.org. Let me first begin again by reminding everyone, please, to mute yourselves and to write any questions in the chat link for Marie. That would be great. I'm hoping Marie will speak for 45 to 60 minutes, and then we can open it up for questions and comments. And then in the next day or two, I'll send out the Zoom recording link. And after the recording finishes, I'll stay on for a few more minutes if anyone would like to debrief. So it's the beginning of Holy Week 2024 as we start this session in the recording. So let's begin with a little prayer. And I invite us to take a moment of silence and to enter into the presence of the God of peace who loves each one of you infinitely, wildly, and unconditionally. And let's welcome the nonviolent Jesus here to our hearts and our community as we listen to Marie, as we begin Holy Week. And let's take a moment to ask for all the Holy Week graces and blessings we need, that we might accompany the nonviolent Jesus on his journey to Jerusalem, on the cross and the resurrection, and follow him always on the path of nonviolence. So let us pray. Beloved God, thank you for all the blessings of life and love and peace that you give us. Be with us now as we reflect with our friend Marie Dennis on the calls for peace from Pope Francis, and inspire us in our own vocations to live out the Beatitudes and the Sermon on the Mount, that we too might be your holy peacemakers, your beloved sons and daughters, that we too might do our part to speak out publicly and prophetically, like Pope Francis, against war, injustice, racism, sexism, poverty, gun violence, nuclear weapons, and all environmental destruction. Inspire us today and during these days. Bless us, energize us, and send us forth, especially now during Holy Week, to accompany Jesus as he carries the cross towards resurrection, peace, and nonviolence, that we might always do your will and welcome your reign of universal love and total nonviolence here on earth. We mass this mighty blessing in Jesus' name. Amen. So, dear friends, again, welcome. I'm very happy to introduce to you my friend on her second time, I think, here with the Beatitude Center, Marie Dennis of Pax Christi International and Catholic Nonviolence Initiative, and many other great groups. So I asked Marie to speak about Pope Francis's recent teachings on peace and creation. And this is a good time to do this as we begin Holy Week, as we're all suffering through and speaking out this evil genocide on the people of Gaza, as we do our part to call for an end to the war, call for a ceasefire and an end to all war, end to the Russian war in Ukraine, end to the wars in Africa. Let me remind everyone, please, to mute yourselves because I can hear people. Thanks. And as we join Pope Francis in calling for the abolition of nuclear weapons and an end to fossil fuels, and we try to speak out boldly. Here's a quote from Pope Francis just a few days ago. It's so powerful. Every day in my heart, this is Pope Francis about 2 weeks ago, I carry the pain and suffering of the populations of Palestine and Israel due to the ongoing hostilities. And so I share my grief for the thousands of dead, the wounded, the displaced, the immense destruction that wreaks pain and suffering on the small and defenseless who see their future so compromised. Do we really think we are building a better world in this way? Enough, please. Let us all say, enough, please. Stop the war. Enough, please. And don't forget tormented Ukraine, where so many people continue to die every day. It is a great as a place of great sorrow. Enough, please.
Yeah.
So some of you may have seen Pope Francis's recent new book, Against War, Building a Culture of Peace, which gathers his statements over the years calling for peaceful alternatives to war and a culture of nonviolence, and for a culture of nonviolence. And that's what I've asked Marie to speak about, among other things. As I said, Marie is the senior advisor to the Secretary General of Pax Christi International and program chair of Pax Christi International's Catholic Nonviolence Initiative. If you don't know about it, please look it up. I think it's paxchristi.net. Well worth studying it. She was the co-president of Pax Christi International from 2007 to 2019, was given the Pax Christi USA Teacher of Peace Award 2 years ago, and has a long history of working with Maryknoll as the director of Maryknoll Office for Global Concerns and with Maryknoll Missioners. She's the author of 7 books, including 2 really important recent books, Choosing Peace, The Catholic Church Returns to Gospel Nonviolence, and a co-editor, Advancing Nonviolence in the Church and the World, which is a collection for all our work at the Vatican. Marie was one of the primary organizers of the 2 conferences on nonviolence at the Vatican and continues to work there. She's a secular Franciscan, a mother of 6, a grandmother of 9, and a member of the CC community in Washington, D.C. Dear friends, please join me in giving a round of applause to the one and only Marie Denis. And now I'm going to mute myself, Marie. The floor is yours.
All right. Thank you, John. And thank you all for taking some time this afternoon to think about what Pope Francis has been saying about peace and care for creation and a lot of other very important topics. So I'm going to share some slides with you because I think it will help you make what I have to say a little bit more interesting. Just please tell me if something is not working. Okay. You see that all right?
Mm-hmm.
Good. So I have to say that when John asked me to do this, I thought, oh, sure, that's a great thing to do. I can manage that. I've been paying attention to what Pope Francis has been saying since he was elected, and have been back and forth to the Vatican quite a lot with the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative. But when I began to really look at what he has been saying, what I have to say, what it felt like was kind of standing under an avalanche, because in the last 10, 11 years of his time as Pope, he has been incredibly prolific and been speaking over and over again about peace, about care for creation, and making very similar points. So I'm going to just kind of go through a bit of an overview of what we've been, as the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative, Pax Christi's program, what we've been particularly paying attention to, and then focus a bit on specifically on peace and the earth. But I hope, my guess is that all of you have paid as much attention to Pope Francis as I have. And so some of this will feel very familiar, and some of it may not be the angle that you've been looking through. And so during our conversation together, please add what I've missed, because there's just so much, as I said, an avalanche of powerful messages. And he conveys those messages, as we know, from how he lives personally. So we know as soon as he was elected, he began shifting, focusing on a simpler lifestyle. He didn't need the red shoes. He wasn't going to ride in a big car. He was going to stay at Santa Marta and not in a large apartment. So how he lived personally, where he's traveled to, I think also describes his priorities. He's, as you know, he's been to many war zones and former war zones. He's been to Sudan, South Sudan, and to Iraq, and to Chile, and to Colombia, and to the United States. He's been to many different parts of the world where, and I think his travels themselves convey a powerful message. The Philippines, I think we all have images in our memories of Pope Francis being just surrounded by enthusiastic people, often in the poorest neighborhoods in the countries that he visits. He also is quite remarkably capable at at designing actions that convey a message, particularly about nonviolence. I don't know if I'm sure we've probably all seen the images of him when he brought the leaders of South Sudan to the Vatican for some peace talks. And at the end of their little retreat, Pope Francis got down on the floor and kissed their feet. He does that kind of thing instinctively. When he was in Bethlehem, he kissed the separation wall that between Israel and the West Bank. When he was in the Congo, he immediately went in the middle of a war and then immediately went to the to meet the Muslim leadership in the capital city. He's just constantly kissing the feet of the foot of an immigrant Muslim in on Holy Thursday. All of these messages are conveyed by how he is, I think, constantly. He also conveys important messages by what he says in the Angelus messages, in homilies, in the messages during audiences, in the catecheses that he's written. It's fascinating. I spent a little time on the Vatican website as I was preparing for this time with you, and was pretty overwhelmed by the not only the amount that he has conveyed to the world, but the consistency with which he has done that. He's, as you know, written encyclicals and apostolic exhortations and messages to what seems like every group that ever gathered in Rome, and a lot of other groups as well. His prayer of the month messages are phenomenal. It's fascinating to see him broadcast as broadly as he has such important messages. And the other dimension of those is that, of the messages that he conveys, is that almost all of them carry a message about peace, or about nonviolence, or about the intersection of the critical issues of our times. As you know, he almost always begins with an inductive process. He begins with experience, most especially with experience at the margins. And I think in that process, you can see his Latin American roots, his experience in South America, in Argentina. He constantly is pushing us to go to the margins if we're not already there, and himself listening to people from the margins. He also is consistently saying everything is connected. So when he talks about poverty, he's talking about nonviolence. When he talks about care for creation, he's talking about poverty. When he's talking about nonviolence, he's talking about care for creation and the global economy and the situation of migrants, and on and on. These four phrases that I have on the slide are, you may remember them when in his first, when he wrote Gaudium et Exsultate, he kind of put out these four phrases that I still am kind of thinking about now. What was he really saying? What does he mean by that? But I think if you pay attention, you hear these phrases represented all the time in his messages. So time is greater than space. United prevails over conflict. Realities are more important than ideas. And the whole is greater than the part. I've thought about those a lot. And I I think I understand what he's saying, but every once in a while, I find that a kind of aha moment where I see him giving an illustration of one of those parts of that framework that I find really fascinating. One recently that I was looking at, he was talking about the war, and it was clear that what he was saying was united prevails over conflict. We can see in the way that he's been moving the church to be a more inclusive church, that he clearly believes in, that realities are more important than ideas, that the experience of people in real life, how they're experiencing life, is more important than fitting everybody into a particular theological or philosophical box, or that the whole is greater than the part, when he is constantly, you can see it in what he's trying to do in Ukraine, and in relation to the war in Ukraine, and in relation to the war in the Middle East, and so on. It's fascinating to watch. We can talk about that a little bit more later if you want. I would love your thoughts on it. So maybe just a little bit of focus on peace and nonviolence. As you know, I'm sure, or I hope you do, Pax Christi's Catholic Nonviolence Initiative focus is on peace and nonviolence. So our way of looking at what Pope Francis is doing is always through the lens of peace and nonviolence, most especially for me in the last 10 years, through the lens of nonviolence. We describe nonviolence as a spirituality, a way of life, a method for change, and a universal ethic. And we believe that it's both important that we understand nonviolence as well as we can in all of its dimensions, in its depth and width, because I think it helps us understand what he's talking about more when he says everything is connected, all is connected. As you may know, and John mentioned, after some years of preparation, in 2016, Pax Christi International and what was then the Pontifical Council for Justice and Peace co-sponsored what was a really small conference. There were about 80 people at the conference on nonviolence and just peace. We had literally knocked on the door of the Vatican for a couple of years to get the Vatican to agree to co-sponsor that conference with us. And we were delighted when they did. It was one of those moments that was both surprising and also delightful. But that meeting, that conference, began a journey of interacting with the Vatican, with the institutional church, with ultimately with Pope Francis, in a way that some of you may have, but I had not before. So I just wanted to say a word or two about that conference, and most particularly about the message that Pope Francis sent to that conference, which you can see here. Said, another cornerstone. This was in a short but a little bit longer message, when he said, another cornerstone is to recognize that conflict cannot be ignored or concealed. It has to be faced. Of course, the purpose is not to remain trapped within a framework of conflict, thus losing our overall perspective and our sense of the profound unity of reality. Rather, we must accept and tackle conflict so as to resolve it and transform it into a link into a link in that new process which peacemakers initiate. That particular message that he sent to us, he knew it was a conference about nonviolence and just peace. And I think he was concerned that we were equating conflict and violence, and that we needed to be careful about how we talked about conflict. You can hear that in his messages quite often. He doesn't shy away from conflict, but he certainly does from violence. The appeal to the Catholic Church to recommit to the centrality of gospel nonviolence that we issued from that small conference was pretty sweeping. We asked the Church to continue to develop Catholic social teaching on nonviolence. We asked for an encyclical on nonviolence. We asked the Church to integrate gospel nonviolence into every dimension of the life of the Church. Excuse me. We asked them, the institutional Church, to initiate a global conversation with other faith traditions, to learn from them about nonviolence, to share with them our understanding of gospel nonviolence. We asked the Church to no longer use the just war tradition, to put it on the back shelf, if you will, in the Vatican. And we asked the Church to lift up the prophetic voices of peacemakers around the world who were already calling for a much greater attention to gospel nonviolence. So we were really happy when very shortly after the conference, Pope Francis wrote his 2017 World Day of Peace message on nonviolence, a style of politics for peace. It was actually, it was less than a year after our conference, and we were really happy that it carried as much of the message of our conference as it actually did. But it was a great breakthrough, because I think it was the first official document from the Catholic Church on nonviolence. It's, as you know, it's been around for a long time, so I'm sure you know it well, but just a couple of quotes from it that I think are worth remembering and that we use very often. To be true followers of Jesus today includes embracing his teaching about nonviolence. It also said, in the most local and ordinary situations and in the international order, may nonviolence become the hallmark of our decisions, our relationships, and our actions, and indeed of political life in all its form. He said, may we make active nonviolence our way of life. And he pledged the assistance of the Church in every effort to build peace through active and creative nonviolence. We are doing everything we can to take him up on that offer. The World Day of Peace message also said, active nonviolence is a way of showing that unity is truly more powerful and more fruitful than conflict. Everything in the world is interconnected. Certainly differences can cause frictions, but let us face them constructively and nonviolently, so that tensions and oppositions can achieve a diversified and life-giving unity, preserving what is valid and useful on both sides. A very familiar document. He also, as you know, he has written 3 encyclicals, Lumen Fidei, Laudato Si, and Fratelli Tutti, and he's written a number of apostolic exhortations, beginning with Evangelii Gaudium, Amoris Laetitia, Gaudete Exsultate, Christus Vivit, Querida Amazonia, and Laudate Deum. We've been particularly attentive, of course, to Laudato Si and to Fratelli Tutti, and to 2 of the apostolic exhortations, Evangelii Gaudium and Laudate Deum, because they have a lot to say about nonviolence, we think. Maybe just let me spend just a little bit of time on what we see in the encyclicals. Obviously, what is included in Laudato Si and in Fratelli Tutti, also in Laudate Deum, is tremendous. It's huge. And I think we've had an opportunity to really dig into those encyclicals. But in them, and in almost every time he opens his mouth, Pope Francis calls for radical change, for a real paradigm shift, for deep conversion. Sometimes he calls for it very subtly, and sometimes he calls for it very directly, very openly. And what he's calling for always it comes out of his own experience. As I said, he's pretty consistent in connecting his teachings with direct experience. So we know that Laudato Si was all about our human relationship with the earth. We believe, and I'll say a little bit more about this later, that a conversion, an ecological conversion, cannot take place without a conversion to nonviolence. They're so of a piece. The way we humans have been living on planet Earth for the last, at least 175 years, has been enormously violent, longer than that. And that has to be a part of our thinking as we move forward in how we care for this planet. So we found Laudato Si to be an extremely rich encyclical. I'll say a little bit more about that in a few minutes. Fratelli Tutti was about human relationships. When we heard that the encyclical was going to be named Fratelli Tutti, we tried every route we could think of to ask Pope Francis to please not name it Fratelli Tutti, but to name it, in a more inclusive way, but it's Fratelli Tutti. But that has to do with our relationships with other humans. A very lot in Fratelli Tutti does relate to peace and nonviolence. Obviously, our relationships with each other are extremely fraught right now. And then Laudate Deum has just this powerful message about sort of following up on Laudato Si. As you know, Laudate Deum is very direct, especially the last sentence or so in his message to the United States of America, to our lifestyle, to our way of failing to care for the earth. But there's one phrase in Laudate Deum that I have thought about a lot that I find phenomenal, is his reference to multilateralism from below. Because I think that Pope Francis, as you know, has a great instinct for an appreciation for popular movements. He has met at least twice with the gathering of popular movements from all over the world. And he understands very well, it seems that he understands very well the importance of popular movements and the power of popular movements. And he's pretty deliberate in reaching out to the most grassroots of movements. And so when he talked about in Laudate Deum about multilateralism from below, I found it totally fascinating because I think he's speaking very directly about nonviolent power there. And he used as examples, I think he used the Landmines Treaty, that the Landmines Treaty and the Cluster Bomb Treaty were both started by grassroots civil society groups that had seen the impact of landmines and cluster bombs, and ultimately were able to move the nations of the world to sign a treaty. And the nuclear TPNW, the Nuclear Ban Treaty, was the same. So say more about that in a minute too. But I think Pope Francis' sense of how power does reside in local people and how important it is for us to exercise that power is pretty striking when he starts talking about peace. So we know in Laudato Si that one of the strongest messages in Laudato Si, I think, was everything is connected. He says that has been a message repeatedly through the last many years, and I think it was very clear there. It's an encyclical about the cry of the earth, the cry of the poor. It's about the way the economic system, the global economy, if it isn't changed, will destroy the planet. It's about personal, sustainable lifestyles and communal and institutional lifestyles. It's about ecological spirituality, that ecological conversion over the last several years, as the Laudato Si action platform has been moving all over the world. One of the pieces of work that Pax Christi International and the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative has been doing has been to encourage religious congregations and local communities and dioceses and anyone who's thinking about how to shape their own plan in response to Laudato Si, to make sure that it includes a commitment to nonviolence and to reflect deeply on how human violence is destroying our planet and how important it is to learn a new way to live. So Laudato Si is just a phenomenal encyclical. Around the time that he was writing Laudato Si, a little bit before it was promulgated in 2015, Pope Francis began to make public statements about nuclear weapons and deterrence. If you remember, there were 3 conferences that were focused on the humanitarian consequences of any exchange of nuclear weapons. Those conferences were convened by non-nuclear weapons states who realized, it's obvious when you look at the predictions, who realized that if there were any exchange of nuclear weapons, that everyone in the world would be negatively affected. And so there were 3 conferences to highlight that fact and to gather momentum among non-nuclear states to push for nuclear disarmament. And at the 3rd conference in Vienna in 2014, the Holy See just sent a message to the conference, but in the message, there was a hint that there was going to be a change to what had been a sort of strictly conditioned acceptance of deterrence, of using nuclear weapons as a deterrent to a nuclear attack. And so in 2014, Pope Francis began to make some noise about that, that there was going to be a change in that. And then in 2017, 16, and 17, the Holy See, the Holy See participants in the United Nations in New York and Geneva and elsewhere, but particularly in New York, played a very active role in developing the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the TPNW. And then once that treaty was written, the Holy See was the first state to sign it and ratified it immediately. It was another very strong message from Pope Francis and the Vatican that there was that a change was coming. And then about 2 months after the TPNW signatures were gathered on the treaty, the Vatican held a conference on nuclear disarmament in November of 2017. During that conference, Pope Francis, I was there. There was an audience, and his statement, which was very short, in one sentence, he said that that there was no moral justification for deterrence. It was kind of slipped into a longer statement, and I remember coming out of that audience and hearing people, especially bishops, say, that was huge. Did we really hear him correctly, that there's no moral justification for deterrence? And what are the pastoral implications of that? How do we interpret that in our own local communities? Very interesting. So Pope Francis, and then he traveled to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He said the same thing there, and he has been repeating over and over and over again, there is no justification for the possession of nuclear weapons, including the justification of deterrence. It was very strong. So that kind of happened between his encyclicals. And then we got hit by the pandemic. Pope Francis took the pandemic very, very seriously. It was fascinating to see how, I mean, it was obviously a shocking moment for the world. It was very dramatic. I can remember him that when he was by himself in St. Peter's Square with a prayer service just in those first few months of the pandemic, and he took it very, very seriously. He particularly began to recognize, to point out all of the ways that the pandemic was pointing to the brokenness of our global society and the injustice and the violence, the many expressions of violence. And I'm going to say more about that in a minute, because he started a COVID-19 commission in the Vatican that then had a huge impact on what he began to develop, to say, and how he was thinking after that. The pandemic was very, very large in his thinking. Then he wrote Fratelli Tutti, which really could be an encyclical on nonviolence, but it's not. So we're still asking for an encyclical on nonviolence. But Fratelli Tutti is it's rich, important, very strong encyclical. He was looking at reality through the lens of the COVID-19 experience, and was talking, what he wrote about in Fratelli Tutti was the urgent need to prepare a new normal. And he began to talk about what that new normal might look like. He was very critical of populism, of the individualistic cultures that were subservient to unregulated economic interests, and also of social institutions that were at the service of people with too much power. He began to be very critical because so many people, the ability to respond to the pandemic was so unequal around the world. There were so many people who simply didn't have the capacity to deal with that pandemic, and yet it hurt everyone. In Fratelli Tutti, he spoke. He talked about a people, which I think is a very important idea in Pope Francis' whole way of thinking. He talks about a people who have a shared identity that arises from social and cultural bonds. It's a people who are living and dynamic and who have a future. So he talked in interesting ways about a people in comparison or over against, in some ways, intense individualism. He talked about political charity, social processes that would promote the common good and justice for all, that were born of a social awareness, and it also would transcend the individualistic mindset. Lot of focus on the common good rather than on me, just me. And he talked about social love, a force that was capable of inspiring new ways of approaching the problems of today's world, of renewing the structures and the social organizations and the legal systems, making it possible to achieve a civilization of love that I think he began to talk about in Laudato Si. He talked about in Fratelli Tutti, he talked about dialogue. You see how he said, between selfish indifference and violent protest, there is always another possible option, that of dialogue. Seems like that's so.
Yeah, but it's not.
Yeah. He said, another, I think, really important, message in Fratelli Tutti is, let us arm our children with the weapons of dialogue. Let us teach them to fight the good fight of the culture of encounter. I thought that was an extremely important and very interesting sentence. Let us arm our children with the weapons of dialogue. Let us teach them about active nonviolence and teach them to fight the good fight to not back away from conflict, but to engage with conflict in a nonviolent way. He also talked about kindness and respect, and how they needed to permeate our relationships, talked about being gentle and pleasant and supportive, interesting. And he focused a lot on truth in Fratelli Tutti. He said, in Fratelli Tutti, there was a section on war. There was a section on the death penalty and on war. And he had already by then had said that there was absolutely no justification for use of the death penalty. But that was included in Fratelli Tutti. And then he had this little section kind of toward the end of the document where he talked about the possibility of a just war. And he said, you know, what I think we've all been saying, that too often wars that were clearly not, that had no imaginable justification had been justified. He was very unhappy about the sort of overuse of even the idea of a just war. He talked about that a little bit. And then a paragraph or two below, he said, we can no longer think of war as a solution because its risks will probably always be greater than its supposed benefits. In view of this, he said, it is very difficult nowadays to invoke the rational criteria elaborated in earlier centuries to speak of the possibility of a just war. War, never again war. And then he had a footnote to that in that area. And the footnote was St. Augustine, who forged a concept of just war, and then that we no longer uphold in our own day, also said that it is a higher glory still to stay war itself with a word than to slay men with the sword, and to procure or maintain peace by peace, not by war. That underlined phrase, that we no longer uphold in our own day, I think is extremely important. And I think it essentially ruled out the use of the just war tradition. Lots more to talk about. This was also written before the Ukraine war, and the Ukraine war has raised lots of hard questions, I think, everywhere, but as well as the importance of nonviolence. The other sort of piece of Pope Francis messaging that we have been quite deeply involved in, because we think it has a lot to do with both peace and care for creation. The first was the COVID-19 Commission. The second is the Laudato Si Action Platform, the economy of Francesco, and then the Synod on synodality. And I'll spend a little bit of time on the COVID-19 Commission. I suspect you all are probably pretty familiar with the Laudato Si Action Platform, but we can, again, talk about these a little bit more later if you're particularly interested. So the Vatican's COVID-19 Commission was a major undertaking. It was, they asked people all over the world to serve on task forces on specific issues. So Ken Buttigieg and I were on the task force on security. There was a task force on care for creation and ecology. There was a task force on health. There was a task force on, I'm not even sure what else. And between April, when the COVID pandemic really got moving, and about August of 2020, and then a little bit into 2021, we were asked to produce volumes of writing that I have no idea what happened to it. I think it may be in a round file somewhere in the Vatican, but I think we produced maybe 20 short papers on assigned topics that Pope Francis was thinking about. So it was the definition of security, it was work and jobs, it was healthcare, it was sort of any food security, and so on. And in each topic, we were asked to write about that topic from the perspective of the task force we were on. So we wrote a really lot of papers on nonviolence and whatever the topic was, but it was really an interesting exercise. And I think what he was doing with that volume of thinking that he gathered was bringing it into the different catechesis that he put together, or into the intention for the prayer intention that he does every month. And I think there's some pieces of it that you can see in Fratelli Tutti, which I think he or someone else was working on it about that time. But it was a very engaged, it was engaged with organizations all over the world in a really interesting way. I don't know that the Vatican had ever done anything like that before. And then it just dissolved eventually. So the second major effort has been the Laudato Si action platform, which I'm sure many of you are involved in. We believe that, excuse me. We believe that that in each of the Laudato Si goals, there are important dimensions that relate to peace. And of course, it all relates to care for creation. And so we produced a resource that's on the website of the Laudato Si Action Network that gives specific examples of how a response to the cry of the poor, or ecological economics, or education or spirituality need to have a dimension of nonviolence because of the connection between nonviolence, violence, and destruction of the planet. The Economy of Francesco is, I think, less well known. Some of you may be involved in it. It's another big effort on Pope Francis' part. He has invited economists and people focused on the economy who are under 35 years of age to imagine a new way of creating the global economy. There have been a couple of meetings, and there's been lots of work online. I think they were slated to have a meeting just when the pandemic hit, and I think they've had one in-person gathering. It's very interesting what he's trying to do there. And then the Synod. You've all been following the Synod, all the steps of the Synod, and we are very deeply involved in the process leading up to the October gathering of the Synod. If you're interested, I'm glad to say more about that in our conversation. But there were two specific, to begin with, we believe that the whole synodal process is a nonviolent process, and that it is helping the church to imagine functioning in a nonviolent way. But there are also two specific mentions of nonviolence in the Synod synthesis document. One, to asking for more thinking about how to address conflict without violence, and the other, how to address the legitimate self-protection and nonviolence. And so in those two areas, we are already doing a lot of work and connecting with many other people who are as well. We can talk about that if you're interested. I want to say a little bit about his books. Pope Francis has written many books. He's most recently, his story about his life, which he hopes will have good lessons for all of us going into the future. But there are three books that I think are particularly important in looking at questions of war and peace and care for the planet. The one that John mentioned is Against War. It's a wonderful little book that it kind of goes through, great, thank you, John. It goes through different contexts to look at how war and violence and nonviolence relate. So he talks about the war in Ukraine, how that has challenged us to find a new way to talk about what does legitimate defense look like? How do we think about legitimate defense without assuming that defense has to be military or armed? How do we imagine preparing for defense that is nonviolent? He looks at sort of all of these questions, no to nuclear deterrence again. One of his most often repeated, most passionate pleas relates to the production, sale, and trafficking of weapons, any kind of weapons. He is constantly calling for an end to economic, an arms economy around weapons being a driving force so often of violence and war in our world. He writes about nonviolence, has a dream, talks about the dream of a future, a better world. Again, talks about everything being connected, about multilateralism. And so he goes in this little book on war. He talks about his experience in Iraq, when he visited Iraq and what he saw there as the consequence of that long war in Iraq. So he again refers to Third World War fought piecemeal, which he has repeatedly used that expression, because he looks around the world and sees in how many places there is war and serious violence. So it's a great little book and worth reading. Second book is Let Us Dream, which many of you may know. Let Us Dream was Pope Francis' effort, I believe, his effort to articulate a new normal for after the pandemic. He looked around and saw the cruelty and inequity that was the reality for so many people's lives, but also he saw a lot of resilience and generosity and creativity. And he sort of, in this beautiful little book, urged us to not let the pain of the pandemic be in vain, but to really use the opportunity of that terrible suffering to imagine a new way of being a global family, a global community. And I think I think often of how heartbroken he must be at our failure, apparent failure to learn very many lessons from the pandemic. There's one story in Let Us Dream that I think is sort of preeminently characteristic of Pope Francis. When he was the Archbishop of Buenos Aires, one night he decided that he wanted to understand what life looked like from the people who were living on the streets in his city. And so he went out with the cartoneros, those who pick up cardboard to sell it. That's how they survive. Without any identification. He didn't wear any bishop or cross of any kind. And he just walked with this community of cartoneros overnight. And he said that it gave him such a different perspective on so many issues, so many policies, on life, on struggle. And I thought that was a very characteristic of his way of being. And then it was in Let Us Dream that he used that beautiful expression, social poets, which is, I think, just, he's so clear in his condemnation of war and violence and environmental destruction and poverty. And he's so creative and beautiful in the way he imagines a new way forward. I'm watching the time, so I'm not going to go on too much longer. There's another book that was it's written in Italian, I think in Italian, and it was translated fairly recently, called I Am Asking in the Name of God, 10 Prayers for a Future of Hope. And I thought it was also very characteristic of what's on his mind. So all of these were, in the name of God, I ask that the culture of abuse be eradicated from the church, that we protect our common home, that the media fight fake news and avoid hate speech, for politics that works for the common good, that we stop the madness of war, that doors be open to migrants, immigrants, and refugees, that there be greater participation of women in society, that the poor countries be allowed and encouraged to grow so that everyone has access to work, a home, and food. He asked that for universal access to health care, and that the name of God not be used to incite violent wars. And then in this little book, he quoted Dr. King saying, the choice today is no longer between violence and nonviolence. It is either nonviolence or non-existence. Very, very powerful. So then there is a plethora of other statements that Pope Francis has made on all kinds of occasions that reflect again and again and again his commitment to peace, his commitment to nonviolence, his concern about the earth, his concern about the people living on the margins, and that the way that those issues are interconnected. I have a number of quotes. I'm just going to refer to where he said them, but each one talks about nonviolence in one way or another. When he was talking last year on the World Day of Grandparents, he talked about the way that there needed to be a spiritual and nonviolent revolution that would be the revolution of tenderness that he's talked about. He talked about, this was in a private conversation with a friend who said that Pope Francis actually said, we have to be in the streets, among the gangs, among the poor, where people most suffer the effects of violence, and there, in those places, show forth the love, the tenderness, the nearness of God. He said, in talking to a group of theologians, he said, I think of nonviolence as a perspective and a way of understanding the world, to which theology must look as one of its constitutive elements. Very interesting, very, very clear about what is nonviolence. In his prayer intention last year, April of 2023, was for a nonviolent culture. If you haven't seen the little video of Pope Francis focused on a nonviolent culture, what he said in that video was, let us make nonviolence a guide for our actions, both in daily life and in international relations. And let us pray for a more widespread culture of nonviolence that will progress when countries and citizens alike resort to less and less use of arms. Very interesting. When he was speaking to the Anti-Defamation League in 2017, he said, faced with too much violence spreading throughout the world, we are called to a greater nonviolence, which does not mean passivity, but active promotion of a common good. In a beautiful exchange with university students that some of you might have seen 2 years ago, he did a series of Zoom conversations with university students in different parts of the world. This one was university students in the Americas. And two students, one who was a graduate student and one who was had graduated from Creighton, another one who was a student at Creighton, said, Pope Francis, we think that every Catholic university should have a center that teaches nonviolence. And his response was very affirmative. He said, violence does not build, it destroys. We need the prophecy of nonviolence. We need the gentleness of nonviolence. Through the path of nonviolence, you reach sincerity and reach all hypocrisy and reject all hypocrisy. In his letter to Cardinal Cupich in Chicago, who had been connected with programs in the Archdiocese supporting nonviolent action locally. And he talked about how important the consistent practice of nonviolence was. In his conversation with Patriarch Kirill, the Russian patriarch, just shortly after the war in Ukraine started, he was very clear. War is always unjust. And he was very direct about that. Again, in just this in October, in an interview I think it was in Vatican News, he said, there's no occasion in which a war can be considered just. There's never a place for the barbarism of war. He kept saying it over and over and over again, very, very clearly. I think that what I think where we are in the conversation about nonviolence and peace and Pope Francis is at sort of a next step that I hope will happen as part of this synodal process, in which after 2 years in Ukraine, after how many years in South Sudan, after heartbreak in the Middle East, watching what's happening in Haiti, it will be very important and very interesting to see where the conversation goes with around is there a justification for the use of military action? Excuse me. And I'm going to stop there. I'm out of a voice, but I'm going to stop there and let you all bring up whatever you'd like to talk about. And but the volumes that Pope Francis has shared with all of us are phenomenal. And I think that he is forever, how much longer he's with us, the legacy that he is giving to us is fabulous.
How about a round of applause, everybody, for Marie's beautiful and brilliant presentation of that. It was wonderful, Marie. Really beautiful and helpful and clear as always, and making sense out of the avalanche of Pope Francis's hopeful messages. It's kind of overwhelming to hear you outline all this good things he's saying that was being so consistently ignored in the United States. So let's begin with John Stoner's question, and I'll elaborate on it. Basically, the response around the world to all of this, Marie, in general, from your seat with the Vatican and Pax Christi International. The positive side would be, how is Pope Francis's message of peace and nonviolence being received around the world? But John has asked specifically, can you comment on the institutional resistance to his call to peace and nonviolence? I think that means primarily the United States. Of course, that leads into any concrete thoughts about what we as Americans can do to respond to all this good stuff you've laid out. He's the most radical pope in history with the way you talk about him. And what can we do about it? So the world's response, the US's non-response, and what can we do about it? And go to town. There's not that many questions. Those are probably the most important things.
Okay. Well, I think there are different dimensions to the answer, John. I think that to begin with, Pope Francis was elected Pope at a time when the credibility of the Catholic Church worldwide was really in question, and because of the abuse crisis. And so there was, I think, on the one hand, I think that I think he's widely respected. I think people have come to understand him as a person of integrity and seriousness. I think that where I started in talking about sort of the ways that he conveys his messages in his lifestyle, in where he visits and who he talks about and who he listens to and so on, I think gives him a great deal of personal credibility. So I think people around the world hear him and are, very much accepting what he's saying. I think that whether the institutional church, either around the world or in the United States, is listening or hearing is probably another question. We've actually been able to interact with quite a few bishops' conferences and bishops, and quite a few Catholic universities in different parts of the world where his teaching is very well accepted. Interesting places, some places where the church was ahead of where Pope Francis is in terms of nonviolence. So in Archbishop Odama in northern Uganda, or the bishops in Japan, and so on. But there are some who are really listening to him, and I think have listened in a new way to what he's saying about peace and nonviolence. I think particularly of Archbishop Chong in Fiji, who just kind of moved in that direction because it's what he's hearing from the church, from the Pope. I think at a more grassroots level, people do hear him, and I think that people who are themselves practicing nonviolence, often in very difficult circumstances of violence in different parts of the world, feel heard by him. But I think they'd also like to be heard a little more. So it's just an ongoing conversation. How much is this being taught anywhere in the world? I think it's very, very uneven. And I think in the United States, it's even more uneven. And I think there is a tremendous resistance to what Pope Francis is saying in the US. I think that especially around the topics of care for creation, ecological justice, ecological conversion, and peace, nonviolence, I think he is particularly pushed back. I think that what he's calling us, especially in the United States, what he's calling us to is so radical that I think many bishops, high-level church people, I think the Bishops' Conference, take pieces and bits and pieces, but I think that I think they feel like, well, we have to really function in the area of realpolitik, and Pope Francis can be visionary and, have an ideal, state what the idealistic, from an idealistic point of view, but, we have to be real. And I think that, so I'm not sure how much this is getting through in any of what he's been teaching in the US. I don't know how many, I would be interested to know how often it gets anywhere near a parish. I do think religious congregations are listening and have been strong supporters and are often implementing. I think many religious communities, a number of parishes, some dioceses have been engaging with Laudato Si. I think that's much more accepted. I think his teaching on just war, there's no such thing as a just war. I think there's still a lot of pushback on that. At the same time, we have found a lot of openness, unexpectedly, to talking about nonviolence, to trying to understand nonviolence. And I think that the challenge, even in the church institutionally, I think that the war in Ukraine has created, from my perspective, it's made it even more evident why we need to make a paradigm shift to nonviolence. But I think many people are saying, well, then what do we do about self-defense? And I think that's a very serious question. So I think my answer to that is we're in a place right now where we may not have nonviolent strategies that are up to the task of defending the people of Ukraine. But if we don't start centering nonviolence, we will always be in this position. Whereas if we actually invest in learning how to use nonviolence, how to be nonviolent, maybe the next time around we'll have another way then to protect people that's truly reflective of the gospel.
Thank you so much, Marie. Very helpful. Let's go to Michelle's question about the synod. So you're welcome to reflect a little bit more. I'll read you what she wrote and then invite you to tell us a little more about October. So Michelle, our friend at Franciscan Action Network, writes, might the synod bring about progress in socializing the concept of nonviolence in the Catholic Church? Could the synod popularize it a little bit more? And is nonviolence therefore being taught in the seminaries and Catholic schools elsewhere? And then also, what are your hopes for October? What are you going to be doing, if you want to tell us?
Okay. Well, I'm always hopeful. So I'm hopeful that the synod will move things along. We, in cooperation with many others, between now and the synod, are reaching out to all of the synod participants with a message that synodality is an expression of nonviolence if it's done right. The process that's being used in synod conversations, conversation in the Holy Spirit is nonviolent communication. So we're starting there, saying nonviolence is not something foreign or external to the synod. It is part of the synodal process. And then what we are hoping is that those two specific questions about nonviolence that were included in the synthesis document and that are likely to be picked up by one of these working groups that were just created by the Vatican. So I don't think this conversation will be finished in October, but I hope it will get up some momentum in October. So we are going to be in Rome in October, and we are going to have, as many others have done, some panels and opportunities for conversation. We will be sharing with participants in the synod process the sort of a succinct collection of some of the best thinkers around those two topics, and then a link to more information. And we'll be probably outside the synod, if we can be, reminding the participants in the synod as they go in every day that nonviolence is part of this process. Don't leave it out. So we'll see. I'm modestly hopeful, but
You're right.
pardon? Go say it. Please say it again.
No, keep going, Marie.
Sister Natalie, who's the undersecretary in the synodal secretariat, is very supportive and has been doing what she can do, as she I think is with everybody. So we'll see what's possible. I have to say that it always feels like you're when you're interacting with the institutional church, it feels like you figure out what you're going to do and you start down a road, and then when you get about 10 steps down the road, you find out that the whole conversation was moved to the other side of the world, and it involves different people, and it's and you're not anywhere in the vicinity of. So it's a constant exercise in humility and in flexibility, and I suspect that the synodal process will be too. But we're going to do our best to keep it in the conversation. We'll see.
Wow, thank you, Marie. Many blessings and prayers to you and Ken and everyone. And isn't this wonderful and amazing how Marie is plugging away at changing the world by changing the Vatican on nonviolence. Wonderful, Marie. So there's several questions and comments basically saying, okay, well, what can we do? So mull on that and I'll read and kind of sum up them. And
Okay.
so I think, and our time is coming up, we have 10 minutes left-ish. What they're trying to get at is, this is all fabulous, and we're such a mess here in the United States, the Catholic Church. What can we do? How can we be concrete? So I'll read you a few of them, but it's whatever, and maybe you can be specific, and I don't know. John writes from Maine, I have been listening carefully for a year now, and I've not heard popes mentioned from pulpits once. And I often wonder if there's a worry about confronting the far-right elements in the church, and that's why priests don't do that. There are some movements that even espouse Christian violence. Mark from Phoenix writes, so how can we help support the Pope's message to renounce the just war theory, his call for nonviolence, and the message of Jesus? And then there was Margaret, who says, so now she's asking specifically about priests and parishes. And I think we need to organize and talk about this more in the US. How can we offer encouragement and courage to priests and parishes to can speak about what the Pope is saying and promote nonviolence and to join us? I just think about that question I've been telling audiences to give copies of my book on Jesus and nonviolence and other writings to your priest. I think another answer, I don't know what you think about this, Marie, but actually, like everyone in this Zoom, I think we should all plan the next 6 months after listening to Marie, go and meet with your local bishop and ask him to promote Pope Francis's message on peace and creation. Anyway, Marie, the floor is yours.
I mean, they're really, really important questions.
Yeah.
And I actually think I think that what is true is that I doubt if there are very many seminaries anywhere that actually are teaching this. So I think most priests get out of the seminary and on the one hand don't know this, don't know even Catholic social teaching, certainly don't know what Pope Francis has been saying, and don't know how to give a homily that isn't timid because it's afraid of upsetting someone. And I think that there is a need for real training in that direction. What I can say about that is that so this whole project with the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative started because we thought if we could get every part of the Catholic Church to teach nonviolence, that it'd make a difference in the world. You know, even if we don't still have 1.3 billion people, we're a lot of people, and we could make a difference. So, we've, in addition to trying to move the Vatican, we've also been very engaged with Catholic universities, with some dioceses, and with, directing people to good resources for parish life. And I think that all of us can do that. I have come to believe in this whole 10 years of that maybe the most important work for nonviolence that we can do in the long run is to teach our youngest children what nonviolence is, how to live nonviolently, how to deal with conflict in a way that is truly nonviolent. So I think every parish, I think that at a parish level, and maybe even in talking to bishops, I love the idea of having you go to visit bishops, that I think what's most important is for all of us to understand more deeply what is nonviolence, that it's a spirituality and a way of life. It's a set of tools that we can use in different circumstances that enable us to accomplish the good without violence. And we think it could be a global ethic, but I think that at a parish level, at the level of schools, high schools, elementary schools, universities and colleges, and in seminaries, we don't have too much. We're working on seminaries through bishops' conferences, but I think encouraging all of those entities to have programs on nonviolence, practical training programs on everything from nonviolent communication to what do you do if you're caught in a situation where there's likely to be violence? How do you respond? Or really learning how Jesus lived nonviolently and what that looked like. I don't think we've delved deeply enough into that in the Catholic Church and the Catholic tradition, and I think we can do that in our homes, we can do it in our parishes, we can do it in schools across the country, around the world. So it's kind of making nonviolence applicable and real in everybody's life every day, all the time. And I'm still learning about that. I think there's a lot to learn. And so I would say, start talking about it. And then we are trying to, I think seminaries are critically important for a lot of reasons. And so we will keep doing the best that we can to reach out, to get access to get access to, we have more access to bishops than we do to seminaries, actually. But uh, pushing them to do. Some of the best bishops have said to me, we don't do any of this in our seminary. In fact, one who's really good said, we don't do anything about this in any of our schools in our diocese. I think that's something to ask, like to ask a bishop to think about that, I think is a possible next step. I think the hardest conversation, and we're going to have to keep having it, but it's very hard conversation, is that sort of point where nonviolence and defense intersect. And I think that I find that it's better to not start there, even though right now it's right in front of our eyes because of the war especially the war in Ukraine. But I think that if we understand nonviolence, if we at a higher level, at the university level or the seminary level or the adult education class level, we actually studied some of the extraordinary research that's been done in the last 10 years, 15 years, that shows that nonviolence is often more effective than violence, not just more morally acceptable, but it's more effective. We could learn that. How you vote makes a difference. Whether or not you speak out about how much the United States pays to prepare for war, to train people for war. What if we spent that amount training people on nonviolence and preparing people to be nonviolent peacekeepers? It would be incredible. So I mean, I think there are real things that we can do, each of us, wherever we happen to be. But it's going to be a long road. I don't think this is going to happen. I don't think we're going to make this paradigm shift in the short term. But I think we're moving in that direction. Partly because we can't keep going down the road that we're on right now. If you just look around the world, that feels pretty obvious.
Oh, thank you so much, Marie. That was very helpful and beautiful. Well, our time is up, and I want to ask you to end by telling us about your own personal witness recently at Gaza. So again, this comes under the framework of what we can do. You're telling us that Pope Francis is just relentlessly, daily calling prophetically for an end to war. And now especially about Gaza and Ukraine and nukes. So he's always saying nonviolent alternatives. Well, what can we do? Well, Marie went the other day, Thursday, to the U.S. Capitol, maybe the Senate office building, and they shut it down. And I didn't know anything about it until yesterday. Art sent out his mailing to me. And I just thought that might be a nice, positive, upbeat way, Marie, you could energize us to go forward in Holy Week, to really, I hope everybody will let everything Marie said sink in as we enter into Holy Week prayer and hear Marie's witness. What new steps can we take? That lovely phrase, Marie, greater nonviolence. Pope wants greater nonviolence. Do you mind sharing us a little bit about the other day?
My guess is that that many of you were involved in a similar witness wherever you are. There have been public actions all over the world, actually, on Gaza, calling for a ceasefire, calling for an end to the fighting, and on, calling for a release of the hostage, for a release of the political prisoners being held by Israel, and for humanitarian aid, for refunding of UNRWA, for so those activities have been everywhere. It just happened that I live in Washington, so I was able to participate in the public action on Thursday on Capitol Hill, and it was a great, not huge, but a very effective action in the Senate office building that just happened to be caught on Fox News unexpectedly. They were filming, interviewing one of the Texas senators, and he all of a sudden this, chorus of calling for humanitarian aid, calling for an end to the war, calling for a ceasefire. And you could hear it very clearly on the Fox News broadcast. And the camera person actually left the camera on, who was it? I'm forgetting which one of the senators it was, for about, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 minutes while he kind of squirmed and listened to the noise from below in the rotunda. And you could hear everything they were saying, could hear everything we were singing.
Wow.
And then they said, well, I guess we'll have to call off the interview. And
Wow.
but it was pretty phenomenal. But also today, and I suspect this is happening in your communities as well, there are people walking 22 miles.
Yeah.
They've done it, as John was saying before, in Australia. They've done it in South Africa. They've done it in many countries of the world. They're walking around Washington starting, I was out at 6 o'clock this morning, walking 22 miles, which is the distance, the distance that you can go in Gaza. So we all have opportunities right now to do that. Keep doing it, because it's making a difference. It's slow, it's hard. It feels like it's not making a difference, but it is. And I think that it is showing that there is another way. That's great. There's a Walk in Phoenix. I think there are many different places. So thank you for all that you all are doing. I'm sure it's more than I can do. And but do stay in touch with the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative. It's
Yes.
we are constantly engaging with people in different, we're not replacing what other organizations are doing very well. Franciscan Action Network and Pace Bene and Meta Peace Team and on and on and on. But we are playing a piece in it and would love to be in touch with you. So thanks.
Where can people get a hold of him, of Catholic Nonviolence Initiative?
You can, I think
PaxChristi.net, and
it's,
there's a
yeah,
little click on there somewhere.
there is. Yeah, that's probably the best way. I was trying to show the last
Okay.
slide I showed, but
Hey, everybody, how about another round of applause for
thank you.
Marie? You did a great
You
job.
will.
Wow, it's so beautiful and helpful and inspiring and empowering. And we really thank you, Marie. And
Thank you
I
all.
hope everybody has been very moved and inspired as I have by Marie's brilliant presentation. And you're in our hearts and prayers, Marie. And let's pray for one another, everybody, as we go into Holy Week, that
Yeah.
we can let all this sink in and be with the nonviolent Jesus as he works for peace by the way of the cross. And I invite everybody to keep coming back to other upcoming Zooms. I'm about to start a whole bunch of Zooms. I got carried away, Marie. And I'm on the road for the next 2 months talking about my book, so I hope folks will come out. Next one is April 13th with Michael Nagler, the longtime Buddhist teacher on nonviolence. He's going to just give a general overview on nonviolence. He's with the Metta Center on Nonviolence. Saturday, April 19th. Great teacher of nonviolence. Saturday, May 11th, a friend of Marie's and mine, Judith Kelly from Washington, D.C., who's been passionate about the famous priest martyr from the Solidarity movement in Poland, who I am also very interested in, Father Jerzy Popiełuszka, who was a very kind of Romero-like character who suddenly stood up and spoke to all of Poland and calling for nonviolence. And Judith is going to give a detailed explanation of his life and teachings, which I hope you all join. Wes Howard Brooke, who's a friend of mine, a theologian, is going to talk about, brace yourself, the book of Revelation on May 25th. Only the calls to total nonviolence in the book of Revelation, which nobody talks about. That in effect, the second coming is the nonviolent coming of the nonviolent Jesus, of a new world of nonviolence. Isn't that wonderful? June 8th, Bill Kellerman on the theology of William Stringfellow. June 22nd, Rivera's son from Pace Bene. She does great work on just talking through all the movements of nonviolence happening around the world. So she's going to talk about the whole world and where nonviolence is happening. You won't hear anybody else talk about that. It's wonderful. And I hope you'll join. And then Brad, let's see. Ann McCarthy on July 13th on Mary Lou Kalnecki's Spirituality of Nonviolence. And then August 3rd, Brad Wolf will talk about his new book about the writings of Philip Berrigan. Join us. You could help me by promoting beatitudecenter.org. Thanks for supporting and promoting my book, The Gospel of Peace. Thanks again, Marie. Blessings on your journey. I'm going to go ahead and sign off now, and we'll say goodbye to Marie and thank you. And those who would like to stay on after the recording and chat with me and debrief, you're very welcome to. So God bless everybody and have a good, prayerful, holy week, and see you the next time, Marie. Okay.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.